to make his presentation. He was to make his presentation first, but because of all the disruptions, he had some challenges joining. Egag, thank you so much for staying on and for joining. I would like to introduce Egag to all of you now. So Egag is a social worker and a psychotherapist with over 8 years of experience working in mental health as a researcher and providing case management and psychotherapy to Black identified children, adolescents, and adults. He is currently a social worker in the substance abuse program for African, Canadian, and Caribbean youth and the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. Egag is a second generation Somali Canadian and a descendant of refugees. He's passionate about working with Black Canadians of all intersectional identities and is excited to be here today as a panelist. Egag will be talking to us about gender-based violence in the workplace, a youth perspective. The floor is yours, Egag. If you could please share your screen if you have a presentation to share with us. You're welcome.
And my name is Egag. It is an absolute pleasure to be in the company of all of you all tonight. I am really looking forward to sharing my presentation. And I also want to emphasize that this presentation is coming from the standpoint of an understanding that many people in the audience have a lot of expertise in the subjects that we're talking about today. And I am here with an acknowledgement of that and an absolute respect for that. And so I want that to kind of inform the way that I will engage with participants today, both in my presentation and follow-up discussion questions. So allow me to and also, Wumi, if you notice that there's any technical difficulties with my slides, just let me know and I will try my best to problem solve.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Alrighty, as Wumi has already been so gracious enough to have introduced me, I am a social worker currently right now at the Substance Abuse Program for African, Canadian, and Caribbean youth. It is a long-standing program that has been around for decades. It's actually probably a lot, almost as old as I am, actually. What I appreciated about this program in particular is the grassroots history of how it came to be, especially in observation of the need for Afrocentric specific services for Black identified youth in navigating mental health, substance abuse, and concurrent and co-occurring related disorders. I will look forward to being able to talk specifically about services and like what we do at SAPAC in particular, in addition to also talking about the youth perspective. I do want to start off with just kind of doing a brief introduction and highlighting some stuff related to the concept of gender-based violence, specifically in the workplace. So I want to start off by, there we go. I want to start off by a show of, I will invite participants to either like type this in the chat box or to even just unmute themselves briefly, being mindful of taking turns in terms of hearing how some people here would define gender-based violence. And I think that that would be a really great place to kind of start from, just in terms of getting a pulse on how people here understand gender-based violence. And I will closely monitor the chat box. I'm also mindful of the fact that some people may not necessarily feel comfortable sharing, and that is totally okay. So I will just give folks opportunity. So I see one response already, and I appreciate that. So violence and discrimination against gender. And I think this is, and what I'm going to do after some of this is I'm just going to share a definition that has been provided by the UN. Are there any other people that have possible answers to share? Yes, I see another response. Violence that is meted out to someone because of their gender. So what we're already noticing now is that we're specifically talking about the the implications of violence targeting a specific gender. And as I show the next slide, which highlights the definition of gender based violence, I also wanted to emphasize that when we talk about gender based violence, we don't talk about it in a way that suggests that there's only one gender identity that experiences violence. And it is not the intention to erase the fact that people of all different genders experience violence. Instead, what we are talking about specifically is from when we look at data and available evidence and even think about some of the structural organizations of society, some certain groups, in addition to their gender and other aspects of their identities, are at greater risk of violence. Again, so it's not to erase other people's experiences of violence, but more so to highlight differences in proportion. So the definition that I'm sharing here is from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And so their definition is gender-based violence refers to harmful acts directed at an individual based on their gender. It is rooted in gender inequality, the abuse of power, and harmful norms. So one thing I like about this definition in particular is that it is really expansive in terms of its conceptualization of violence in particular. Violence here is recognized not just solely on the basis of physical or sexual violence. It is also the harmful acts, and the harmful acts can take different forms, such as targeting a person on an emotional level. It can also be economic marginalization of people in particular. And it is really important as well to be mindful of these, because some of these other forms of violence, because of the nature that they're not necessarily visible to the human eye, it can oftentimes make it quite challenging to identify, and therefore a lot more challenging to address. So as I had said before, going back to the gender-based violence concept, so we are not erasing the fact that all people can experience violence. Instead, we are looking at the fact that some people are at greater risks of violence due to their gender, in addition to other identities or experiences that they may have. And so this is a list of some examples of different identities and experiences at the intersection of being a woman in particular, that may contribute to being at greater risk of violence or reporting higher frequencies of surviving violence. And this is based on police reported data. So some examples here, you can see the intersection of age and gender. So young women and girls in particular, women living with disabilities, which would include both visible and invisible disabilities, race and gender. So here we see Black women, newcomers to Canada, which also highlights some of the vulnerabilities as well of being a newcomer, in addition to also being a woman in Canada. In addition to the broader group of sex and gender minority individuals, which includes lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual plus peoples. I'd like to actually share some statistics related to gender-based violence. So here we have from a study from last year where it highlighted that young women between the ages of 15 to 24 were 5 times more likely than women ages 25 and older to have been sexually assaulted. They are 3 times more likely to have been physically assaulted, and 3 times more likely to have been emotionally, financially, or psychologically abused by an intimate partner in the last 12 months. when we are also looking at visible minorities in particular, some of these statistics here highlight that women, or actually, my apologies, the first one is showing women specifically in the context of post-secondary education. So that would include college and universities and other post-high school related study programs. So there is a study here from 2020 that highlighted that 1 in 10 women students living in provinces experience sexual assault in post-secondary settings in the past year. When looking at the intersection of women and visible minorities, which includes racialized identities that are non-white and outside of the Indigenous and Aboriginal ethnic cultural background. And what that shows is that they were slightly more likely than women who are not visible minorities to have experienced unwanted sexual behaviors in public that made them feel unsafe or uncomfortable in the years preceding. Finally, and to also be mindful as well of the intersection of people from sex and gender minority experiences as well. A study from 2020 highlighted that there are approximately 75,000 people living in Canada who are trans or gender diverse, which represents 0.24% of the Canadian population 15 and up. It also showed that there is evidence to show that they were more than twice as likely to have experienced unwanted sexual behaviors in public spaces that made them feel unsafe or uncomfortable, in addition to greater experiences of this in the workplace as well. And as I'm highlighting all of these in particular and highlighting the statistics in particular, I also want to be sensitive to the fact that studies and these statistics, they are not wholly representative of everyone's single experiences. And some people in the audience might look at some of these statistics and not necessarily feel their whole experiences or aspects of their identities are not necessarily being heard. And I really want to acknowledge that and emphasize that this is only a sample of some of the statistics that is available. Before going on to talking about the implications of gender-based violence in the context of mental health and health, I think it is really important to also briefly talk about the implications of gender-based violence in the workplace, while also being mindful of the fact that workplaces have looked a lot different in the last 2 years since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. So as we've seen beyond the declaration of the COVID-19 virus being a global pandemic, we've seen a shift into remote-based working from home, in addition to also hybrid-based working models. And what that I think is really important to be mindful of the fact that people have highlighted that there are really great things to come out of working from home or working hybrid models, in that they might reduce their exposure to potential risks of gender-based violence in the workplace. Although that's not to necessarily say that one is completely free of any risk whatsoever when working from home. And I think this also highlights the fact that there is still the impact of being online and so much of remote work being dependent on access to the internet. We know that cyberbullying is a very real phenomena, with data showing that that does have an impact on people's mental health and well-being, and can also be an incredibly traumatic experience. So I think it's also really great to be thinking about the fact that the transformation of what the workplace looks like these days has given lots of really good opportunities for people to feel a sense of safety, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people are always going to be safe, even if they're working remotely. Bringing it kind of back to the context of mental health and gender-based violence, I think it is really important to know. And I also want to be sensitive to the fact that there might also be people here in the audience who may also have lived experience, and that some of this might also resonate with them directly or indirectly. And I really want to honor that by recognizing that exposures to gender-based violence can be traumatic, and it can deeply impact one's mental health. It is also important to recognize as well that the trauma piece is can be quite complex. I brought a definition from my workplace at CAMH in trauma, which here it's defined as a term to describe the challenging emotional consequences of living through distressing events that it can have on an individual. And it's not necessarily to say that every single person will experience a traumatic event the same way. And some people might respond to it. Some people might respond to a traumatic event perhaps sooner than others. Some people might have the resources as well to overcome a traumatic experience. And I think it is really important that when we think about the fact that not every single person has the same mental health journey and responds to the same types of violence and traumatic experiences in the same way, that when we know people in our lives that we are curious about who may be at risk or may have even survived some gender-based violence, that when we want to engage and talk to them about their experiences of gender-based violence, it is really important for us to meet them with compassion and openness to their stories. And when talking about gender-based violence and talking about reaching out to people that we know, I specifically want to highlight ways in which we can connect with other people in our lives who might be experiencing this, and especially youth in particular. I am confident that there are plenty, if not most, if not all members of the audience who have young people in their lives that they admire and young people that look up to them, respectively, have the particular wisdom and knowledge in being able to help guide them or be a really supportive ear. At the same time, as someone who has worked with youth, in particular over the past few years, I have also been very humbled by the fact that even when I think about my relative age to the youth that I work with, I'm recognizing that being a youth in today's age is very different than what it was like for me in particular. And sometimes it is also a practice for me to be open and to really listen and to even be especially sensitive to when I'm hearing experiences of young people that doesn't even sound like it exists within my own realm of what sounds plausible. So here I am highlighting some of the ways that we can take action in terms of supporting loved ones, and especially young people. And this is from a handout from the Canadian Women's Foundation called the Signal for Help Responders Action Guide. And some of the things it highlights is focusing on the person being hurt, understanding that everyone copes with abuse differently, listen to the person who you're speaking with and let them lead, be judgment-free, especially mindful of potential judgment that may come up, and to be patient and open-minded. I also want to recognize that when supporting people who have experienced gender-based violence, I think it is also important to recognize that mental health also goes beyond simply having access to a supportive ear, goes beyond access to therapy and counseling. There are oftentimes even aspects of working within a workplace where they may not necessarily feel safe to open up or reach out to a person because they may worry about the consequences of losing a job. And thinking about the costs of living and the fact that they're continuing to increase, I think it is also really important to be sensitive to the fact that mental health can also mean a person's access to housing, a person's access to a sense of financial security, also access to food and some of the other things that are really important to get us throughout the day or to even get us through the month. Which leads me to talking about specifically within the workplace, if we want to talk or engage with youth, or anyone really in the workplace and is experiencing gender-based violence in the workplace, and we want to support them feeling empowered to confront this gender-based violence. There are several different resources, and I think that it is helpful to suggest these, but to also be mindful of the fact that not every single person who has these resources or is aware of these resources might not necessarily feel comfortable to jump right away into using these resources. But I do think it is helpful to just let them know that there are resources and to also just check in on them with where they are in terms of their comfort level with reaching out. Sometimes just even inviting them to have these options and just letting them know that you're there can be a really meaningful step for when they are ready to reach out. So some of these options here are Occupational Health and Safety Act, which is, so we do have, there's legislation here in the Ontario province by the Ministry of Labor in which there are, if a person's exposed to gender-based violence, they could seek recourse with that. They may also have co-workers or members of HR that they may trust, or maybe they might even have access to a union representative if they work in a place that has a collective bargaining unit. And then there's also the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. In closing, I wanted to close off this presentation by, again, reminding each and every one here of the fact that I believe that each and every one of us has, and from a strengths-based perspective, has the capacity to have a meaningful impact on people in our lives who are affected by gender-based violence. And I think one of the most important things that we can do is to provide a supportive place for people to be vulnerable enough to share that with us. And I want to close it off with a really lovely quote from a book by Tarana Burke and Brene Brown on the blues of vulnerability. And looking at the time, I will just highlight the first sentence here. The most egregious consequence of living in a persistent traumatic stress environment is the inability to feel. We know from research that emotional numbing is a coping mechanism to avoid processing the emotional turmoil. It's like hiding from your emotional self, stuffing all that emotion into a box and tucking it neatly away down in the basement. And just left my contact information at the very end if people are interested in reaching out about how we at SAPAC could provide services if there are any Black identified youth that are in need of resources. So thank you so much.
Thank you.